Did Oranmiyan rename Igodomigodo to Ile Ubinu? No. It's absolute bullshit. A myth regurgitated by people who would rather lick the dust off colonial era propaganda than crack open a history book. So to the keyboard warriors who've been camping under Benin videos since 1804, crying about Ife and chasing the Oba family trees like it's a Netflix series, this video will surgically dismantle every lie you have been spoon-fed. So sit down. This video is your intervention. But first, let's address a basic but apparently underrated skill: reading comprehension. Because these days it seems the latest trend in historical revisionism is citing books you have clearly never read and praying to the gods of ignorance that nobody notices. You see, you love to throw book titles around and hope people don't read them, because your entire argument relies on the classic trifecta of intellectual fraud, cherry picking, quote mining, and contextomy, where you read an entire library, tear out just 2 sentences that vaguely nod at your delusion and scream, "See, the book agrees with me," conveniently ignoring the 300 pages that call you a liar. No wonder you are all over social media, barking and foaming at the mouth with mangled excerpts you have never read past the footnotes. Listen, scholarship isn't a buffet where you snatch the jollof rice and pretend the bitter leaf soup doesn't exist. No. In fact, this is worse. It's like plucking 1 grain of pepper from a full pot of soup, then screaming, "This proves the soup is spicy," while ignoring the gallons of tasteless broth drowning it. And let me make something clear moving forward. I do not need to provide new evidence to debunk your historical gymnastics. You have already done the work for me. Every source you quote, every screenshot you rage post, every gotcha excerpt you frantically copy paste, they all got your argument in broad daylight. Because when you strip away the sentiment and actually read those books, those posts, those excerpts, those screenshots, these texts don't defend your dogma. They expose it, they touch it. But let's hold that in abeyance while I offer you a crash course in reading comprehension. We are expected to believe this fairy tale that Oranmiyan came to Igodomigodo, a land he knew nothing about, couldn't speak the language, couldn't rule, and because of his frustration, he got angry and renamed the place Ubinu or Ile Ibinu, the land of anger, in his so-called Yoruba tongue, or so they say. So from there, we are told Europeans misunderstood this emotional outburst and mangled it into Benin, and finally Benin. And just like that, no scrutiny, no logic. Millions have swallowed this simply because someone draped it in the cloak of tradition, oral tradition. But in a logical context, that's like a man walking into a job interview, failing the test, storming out in frustration, and somehow getting credit for founding the company or renaming it. Pathetic, right? The only thing more fictional than this story, this fairy tale, is Wakanda. And at least Marvel admits Wakanda is made up. That's the difference. So can you see the absurdity in such lazy and twisted reasoning? Now, to spoon feed this wisdom to his flock of alamajiris, this court jester, with all the scholarly rigor of a roadside palm wine lecturer, proceeds to break down which of his so-called Yoruba dialects the legendary Oranmiyan supposedly spoke. So, ladies and gentlemen, behold his ex-revelation, delivered with the confidence of a man who's never once doubted his own genius. How convenient. One can only marvel at the linguistic parkour required to spin a single word into an entire historical thesis. Truly, the internet's greatest minds are at work. But honestly, one struggles to decide what is more impressive in his mumbo jumbo: his commitment to cosplaying as a linguist, or the sheer audacity of trying to pawn off this linguistic LARPing as actual scholarship. This isn't research. It's mythological ventriloquism, a clumsy art of throwing words into history's mouth, only for them to tumble out like loose teeth, full of holes and laughably unconvincing.
After ruling the Edo people for some years, Oranmiyan later decided that it was better if Edo was ruled by an Edo person and not him, who was a foreigner. So Oranmiyan and the Edo elders therefore installed a young son born to Oranmiyan by one of his Edo wives as king of the Edo people.
Let's cut through the noise. That Oranmiyan Ubinu fairy tale isn't history. It's a hoax, a myth, a big fat historical bongo dressed up as scholarship. And no, shouting Oranmiyan all the time like it's some magical incantation won't suddenly make up for your lack of scholarship. That's not how history works. It's how delusion metastasizes. However, today is not for feel-good folktales or ethnic fantasy. We are not here, I'm not here for emotional fables. Today, we are dissecting this line by line, logic by logic, and most painfully for you, using your own sources to bury your nonsense once and for all. Let's begin with their own Yoruba tradition. Yoruba myth already acknowledged a place called Ibini before this Oranmiyan fairy tale. Like I said, let's use their own sources, right? Now, in Richard Burton's 1863 book, Abeokuta and the Cameroon Mountains, which has been frequently referenced by these eccentric ethnomythologists and tribal propagandists, page 229 and 230 says clearly, a third tradition makes Iketu, Egba, Ijebu, Ife, Ibini, and Yoruba 6 brothers by one mother. Did you catch that? Ibini, not Ubinu. Ibini. First of all, the book presents not one but multiple contradictory origin myths about the Yoruba. One version claims the Yoruba originated as an offshoot of Nupe. Another version says they came from a group of 16 people who journeyed through water with a hen, a palm nut, and a piece of cloth. Then another version, and this is the one they really don't want you to notice, right? This version says Iketu, Egba, Ijebu, Ife, Ibini, and Yoruba, 6 brothers by one mother, which means the place we now call Benin was already known, already named before Oranmiyan supposedly arrived. So how do you rename a place your people already said existed? How do you name your elder brother? What kind of historical amnesia is that? You cannot discover what your own myth says existed before you. That's like claiming you discovered your elder brother and then gave him a name. It doesn't work like that. How does a place go from being a known sibling in your tradition to something you personally renamed out of annoyance? So how does Oranmiyan get to rename Ibini as Ubinu when Yoruba traditions already refers to Ibini as part of their own ancestral narrative? This is what happens when people don't read their own sources, or when they are disingenuous, of course, when they lack integrity. This is what happens. And this exposes the whole Oranmiyan named Benin narrative as a retroactive invention designed to legitimize political ties after the fact. Now, let's take another look at this gem from this so-called professor. Permit me to apply their own smelly logic, if that incoherence can even be called logic. Beni, Bini, Benin are all European or colonial identities bestowed on the Edos. Their original identity as bestowed on them by the Yoruba was Ubini, from Ibinu, anger. Stop right there. So let's assume for a second that my logic is smelly. But this right here is what I'll call pseudo-etymology on crack. You see, he's trying to sound smart by referencing dialect zones like CY, SEY, NEY. But none of that changes the fact that the Yoruba myth already mentioned Ibini. That destroys his entire argument. You see this post, that tweet, much like his Ahmed Baba-esque Yoruba and Uruba wordplay, is a masterclass in linguistic grift. The kind where historical rigor goes to die and confirmation bias gets a PhD. A classic example of the art of linguistic fraud. He even claimed Yoruba bestowed Ubinu on the Edos, as if we are some toddler tribe waiting for naming rights from our angry neighbors. How preposterous. Dang. So, according to his pseudo-etymology, Yoruba gave Edos the name Ubinu, which is Central Yoruba, Southeast Yoruba, and Northeast Yoruba dialects for anger, right? And eventually, Ubinu became Benin, a colonial name, right? But the same Yoruba tradition from the same sources they reference says Ibini already existed. So which is it? Was Ubinu a product of Oranmiyan's anger, or was Ibini a sibling from the start? You see how contradictory and confused this is, right? This is why you don't build history. You don't build serious history on emotion, ego, and myth that change every time the wind blows. Let me say this with my full chest. We never needed Yoruba that didn't exist until the 19th century to name us. The name Benin may be a colonial exonym. Yes, we have never denied that. But so is Yoruba. And unlike you, we are not confused about our real identity. We have no identity crisis whatsoever. We are Edo. We speak Edo. When we speak among ourselves, we ask, are you Edo? Oviedo here. Oviedo here. Do you speak Edo? Uzedo. Ugwazedo. Never are you Bini, like Ovie Binu here. How? Seriously? Or do you speak Bini? Ugwaze Bini. Uze Bini. Never. In fact, Bini doesn't even exist in our indigenous vocabulary. The word Bini is not even in Edo language. Bini is not an endonym, and we have never refuted that. But the difference is we know it's an exonym. You don't even know yours is. You keep changing the origin story every Saturday and still act like it's divine truth. Either bring one consistent claim and defend it with evidence, or just kindly sit this one out, or have a family meeting and decide which one. You know what's amazing? The way Ife-centric fanatics can take any non-Yoruba word, twist it, and claim it's dialectical deflection. So by your logic, Timbuktu must be from Timbaku, the Yoruba word for we almost died. And Mozambique came definitely from Mozambique, Yoruba word for I dodged dead, right? It's not etymology, it's linguistic madness. So no, we are not trying to reclaim Benin as some original name. We are rejecting the lies that it came from a Yoruba man with anger issues. Now, I know what you are thinking, but Jacob Egharevba said Oranmiyan named it Ile Ibinu. Yes, in his book, A Short History of Benin, page 11 to be precise. But let me school you on what you have never been told. Egharevba was writing under colonial pressure, heavily influenced by the British indirect rule system that encouraged mythical unification of polities. In fact, look at his own preface, page 2. He thanks His Highness Akinzwa II, the Oba of Benin, and also the late Oba Eweka II for their advice and aid. You know what that means, right? It means that book wasn't written in a vacuum. It means these monarchs were involved in shaping a narrative that would, 1, rebuild Benin's image after the 1897 invasion, 2, appear peaceful and unthreatened to colonial authorities, 3, validate the British idea of indirect rule through native authorities. That is what that preface, that mention, that is what it means. At that time, being seen as part of a bigger regional royal network, even with Ife, may have seemed strategically beneficial. But that doesn't mean it is true. It doesn't make the story true. It just shows you that history under colonial rule was never just history. It was survival. And that's not research. That's politics. Jacob Egharevba's book was partly politics. Egharevba was a brilliant man, no doubt. But he was also a man of his time, trying to preserve peace, gain favor, and tell a unified story under colonial rule. First, the book was written and published in 1934 during full British colonial rule, just decades after the violent 1897 invasion of Benin. And we just had Eweka II a couple of years before. Secondly, the initial edition was locally supported, but later reprinted and distributed through the Church Missionary Society bookshop in Lagos, a colonial Christian press that served as a soft power tool for the British. Now ask yourself, if your kingdom had just been sacked, looted, humiliated, and your ruling authority needed to rebuild cultural prestige under a colonial government obsessed with native administration and traditional rulers, wouldn't you be strategic about the kind of history you publish? So the question isn't, did Egharevba write it? The real question is, who did he have to write it for? So if you want to use Egharevba as a source, just know this. He wasn't an oracle. He was an editor. Back to the book, the same book, Abeokuta and the Cameroon Mountains. Now let's talk about what the book really says. It didn't just mention Ibini, it classified Ibini, Iketu, Egba, Ijebu, Ife, and Yoruba as 6 brothers by one mother, meaning separate entities, not subgroups, not dialects, not fragments of a single Yoruba identity. And to make it even more ridiculous, it says Yoruba was the youngest, the Benjamin of the family. So how does the last born suddenly become the father of the others? How does the junior sibling name the elders? It's like claiming your little brother gave you your name in the womb, right? Please make it make sense. What we are seeing is not historical fact, it's mythology repackaged for identity consolidation. They say Benin was named by Oranmiyan, but their own myth shows they already knew Benin, Ibini. They say all these polities, Egba, Ijebu, Iketu, are Yoruba, but the book says they were brothers, not branches. They say Yoruba is the parent, but Yoruba was the baby of the family. That's what the book says. How much more selective and incoherent can it get? And let me be clear, I'm not quoting these myths because I believe in them. No, I'm quoting them because they do. This is the myth they claim, because everything about Ife, everything about Oranmiyan, everything about Obagodo, Obatala, they are all myth. And it's about time someone held up a mirror, because it's either you accept your own myth in full, or you admit you have been crafting new ones to suit your agenda. You can't claim civilizational superiority based on myth that makes you the youngest child of the family. And you definitely can't use a book like Abeokuta and the Cameroon Mountains to support your claims when that very book exposes your contradictions. So all this talk about everyone being Yoruba from the start is nothing but a political project, not historical fact. But wait, one sec. Now, if Oranmiyan couldn't even speak the language, why would we accept his name for our land? Did he come with a UN-approved naming authority that made us accept it? Or did he just storm out like a child who failed a test and say, you know what? I'm mad. Let me name this place Angerville. Come on, man. You can't colonize our history with emotions. No, you can't do that. Now, before I go, let's clear the air on this one final point. You all keep shouting, Egharevba said it, Egharevba said this, Egharevba said that. Fine. But if that's the hill you want to die on, that historical text should be taken verbatim, then let's do the same with Samuel Johnson, the father of Yoruba historiography. Now, in his book, The History of the Yorubas, published in 1921, let's agree for a moment, even if we know better, right? Let's agree for a moment to take Jacob Egharevba verbatim. But to be fair, let's now apply that same literal standard to Samuel Johnson, the architect of Yoruba historiography. Because if you quote one colonial era historian, you must quote them all, right? So let's begin. Now, according to Samuel Johnson's The History of the Yorubas, Yoruba is a Hausa word, not native. On the very first page of the History of the Yorubas, Johnson writes, in old records, the Hausa and Fulani names are used for the country and its capital. Thus, we see it in Webster Gazetteer, Yoruba. So, according to Samuel Johnson, your own literary ancestor, Yoruba is not even a Yoruba word. It's Hausa. You didn't name yourself. Others did. Just like you accuse Edo people of accepting Benin. So your beloved ancient Yoruba identity, it was actually a foreign label, right? Popularized in colonial dictionaries. Let that sink. Let's go to the second point. Still on the same page, he also wrote that the capital of Yoruba was Katunga, Old Oyo, not Ife, not Ile-Ife, not Ibadan, not Abeokuta, which means the core of Yoruba identity was originally Oyo-based, not Ife-centric. This is getting interesting, right? Capital, Katunga. These are Hausa terms for Yoruba and for Oyo. So how did Ife suddenly become the headquarters of the Yoruba world when even your founding historians admit Oyo was the center of power? On page 4 and 5, after recounting the whole Lamurodu Ododuwa saga, Johnson writes, the Yorubas are certainly not of the Arabian family and could not have come from Mecca. No such accounts are to be found in the records of Arabian writers. Samuel Johnson called your origin myth as a folk tale of unlettered people, not a historical fact. So let's not pretend your origin myth came with a passport and visa. So if your own historian did not believe in your myth, why are you forcing it on us? Why are you trying to make us a footnote of your myth? Johnson also wrote, this country comprises many tribes. All were tributaries to one sovereign, the king of Yoruba, including Benin on the east and Dahomey on the west. Wow, this is getting more interesting. So even in your founding text, Benin is acknowledged as a distinct tribe with its own rulers and laws. How then did Oranmiyan name a place your book says existed independently? And more interestingly, now that Johnson said Benin is to the east of Oyo, you believe that, right? Because Johnson called it a tributary to Oyo. Yet you are still forcing us to believe that Ife is also to the east of Benin, just because you want to retrofit it into Duarte's Organa. Una they lie with confidence, yeah? So Benin is to the east of Oyo, and Ife is to the east of Benin. Dang. This one hurts, right? I know. But on page 9 and 11, Johnson says, Oroyan was placed on the throne as the Alafin, or Lord of the Royal Palace at Ife. So wait, it was Alafin of Ife, not Ooni of Ife. Whoa. Then comes Adimu, who Johnson described as the son of a sacrificial victim, dedicated to the gods, custodian of the king's treasure. When the king moved to Oyo, Adimu became supreme at Ife, not as a king, but as a fetish priest of Olorisha. So by Johnson's account, the Ooni is a descendant of a ritual priest, not a crowned monarch. His title was born out of spiritual service, not political rulership. So tell me, how does a temple custodian now claim supremacy over kings who were already ruling long before him? That's like the church treasurer becoming the pope because the bishop traveled. And now you are telling us this man became the supreme king of all Yoruba? Come on. So if you want us to take Egharevba word for word, it's fine. Then we will also take Samuel Johnson word for word. And when we do that, what do we find? Yoruba is a Hausa exonym. The Ooni was a priest who became a glorified temple manager, not a king. The capital of Yoruba was Oyo, not Ife. Ododuwa came from an uncertain Arabian folktale. He becomes a Middle Eastern castaway. Benin was already listed as a distinct polity, not a child of Ife. And your entire kingdom rests on a colonial interpretation of priesthood, not kingship. You can't demand that we treat Egharevba like a divine authority while ignoring Johnson, the man who literally gave your people a historical voice. You can't cherry pick one colonial era historian while burning the pages of another who contradicts your modern myth. So either you take both, or you admit that your entire narrative is a patchwork of political myth, not history. Because once again, you can't be the last born and the ancestor at the same time. You can't pick and choose what to believe from colonial text. If you treat Egharevba as scripture, you must treat Johnson as gospel. And if you do, you will see that your entire myth of supremacy collapses under the weight of your own sources. So let's stop the bluff. Let's stop the cosplay kingship. And let's start telling the truth. Because Benin never needed Oranmiyan to name it. Especially not from a culture still arguing about whether it came from Mecca, Nimrod, or a sacrificial lamb. And for those of you who would still come and start accusing me of trying to divide Yoruba, or that I hate the Yoruba, I really hope you understand that all I am doing is simply responding to falsehood being propagated by Ife-centric apologists. Not all Yorubas. This has nothing to do with Yoruba. This is to debunk all the false claims by the Ife-centric. And with this, I do hope you understand by the sources they provided that Oranmiyan didn't name Benin, because Ibini, according to the Yoruba myth, already existed before Oranmiyan.